this is Ana from the Bajo Moton, and this is Knitting 101, Lesson 4. Now in this lesson you're actually going to learn to knit. But before we start, just make sure you've watched Lesson 3 because that will teach you how to cast on your stitches and you can't actually get started without it. Now there are many different stitches that you can make with your knitting needles and your yarn. There's lace, which can be stunningly beautiful. There are cables, there are very textured stitches, and I'm sure you've seen many examples in knitted garments out there. But all those fabrics are variations of the two basic stitches, which are the knit stitch and the purl stitch. All those fabrics are just variations, manipulations of the two stitches, and that's what we're going to learn today, how to make the knit and the purl stitches. And then we'll see how just using those two without any manipulation creates two different kinds of fabric, the stockinette stitch fabric and the garter stitch fabric, which is a good start to understand how it works. Well, let's start with the knit stitch then. If you watched the previous lesson, hopefully you've chosen your favorite cast on and you have your 10 stitches ready to go. If you haven't, either do that or make sure you have 10 stitches cast on, since we're just making a sample. So here I use the long tail cast on. I have 10 stitches ready. I'm keeping the tail away from my knitting so I don't get confused. I'm holding my cast on stitches on the needle on my left hand. The working yarn is to the right. That's the way it's always going to be when you're knitting, unless you're knitting in the round. Well, it will still be to your right, but it's a little different. And now let's hold our yarn just like we did for casting on with the knit on. You wrap it around your pinky, hold it with the 3 fingers, and now put your index underneath. And again, just like we talked about for the knit on cast on, the tension will probably be too tight at the beginning. You're going to need to experiment, and you may even just hold it differently. Some people just hold it like this, but I find it doesn't give me enough control. I like to have it wrapped around my pinky. And you'll need to learn to loosen your pinky so that the yarn runs. It's not so tight. But that will come with practice. Now I'm sure it's going to feel like you are all thumbs, but that's fine. It's the way it is. So hold your first stitch with this index finger to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere. Your right needle goes into the first stitch, goes under the needle, the other needle, and now with your index make sure you're holding everything in place and wrap the yarn under and over the needle. And now comes the tricky part, and it's useful to have your index finger holding, like pushing against the tip of the needle so you can do this movement, and now you can let go. Okay, so there's your first stitch on the right needle. Now let's do it again. And again, the index finger on the right hand is holding on to this stitch, and the index finger on the left hand is holding on to these stitches. Again, we'll go in under the needle and make sure you're going in the middle of the stitch. See, make sure you're not going in between the stitches. That can happen. You want to be inside the stitch. Push your needle in. Now make sure you're holding everything. Wrap under and over. Hold everything in place and bring it to the other needle, and now you can slip the second needle. And again, use your index fingers to hold the stitches in place. In, wrap the yarn around, and now bring it to the other needle and slide it off the left. And often you'll need, you see how those stitches are all uneven? It doesn't matter. You're just, manipulating them, and as you move them onto the other needle, they will even out. Now a word about tension. At the beginning, as I said, you'll tend to pull this yarn very tightly, and it can make it very difficult to do this part. If you're holding your yarn so tight that you can't bring it over, you're actually making your life harder. It won't slip off, but it will be very hard to manipulate. So try to just let the yarn be. Just make sure you're not pulling it so tight that you feel it on this stitch. Just try to leave it so that it's somewhat relaxed. See how my finger is not actually pulling until I wrap? That's what you're looking for. So let's try it again. Index fingers holding the stitches in place. Slide under the needle into the stitch. Hold both needles together and wrap around. Bring it to the other needle and slide off. Now again, under the needle, wrap the yarn around, and basically you're wrapping this stitch around this needle, and now slide it off. And it's okay to pull a little bit on this stitch, because when you insert your other needle, you're pulling it back into place. Wrap it around, change needles and slide it off. And you will also find that you need to use your index finger to slide these things a little closer or a little further to make your life easier. In, hold everything together, wrap around, and change needles. Slide this one off. All right, and now this is a common problem that you can find. Sometimes your yarn or your stitch looks like, is this one stitch? Is it two stitches? It's one. And one way that you can figure it out is just slide it off and look at it. It's all these little strands are coming out of the same bottom stitch. So, and when you separate them there, you can see that it's one stitch. If you had put your needle there, see, you're splitting the yarn. Okay, so just make sure you're using the whole stitch. Wrap it around, change needles and slide off, and now you're on to your last stitch, and that can be a little tricky, so make sure you are holding it in place. Slide it, wrap around, over, and now let go, and there's your first row of knitted stitches. And now you simply switch hands again. So you're holding your stitches, your needle with the stitches on your left hand. Your yarn is to the right. Wrap it around your fingers and start again. In, wrap the yarn around, hold it in place, and switch needles. In, wrap it around, switch needles, slide off. In, wrap, switch, off. In, wrap, switch, and off. So let's do a few rows. Make sure when you get to the end, you simply switch hands. Okay. There's your second row. And now you turn it again. Do a few rows, and then we'll talk about the fabric that you've created at the end. Well, so hopefully you've knitted a few rows, and you should have a little piece that looks like this. And now we're going to move on to the purl stitch, and you will see how this changes your fabric. Okay, so we're going to start the same way. We have the knitting on the left hand. We're holding the stitches with our index finger, keeping everything in place. We wrap the yarn around the right hand. Oops, and you don't want your needle in the middle. Now, you can see that I'm knitting with wooden circulars because this is my preference, but obviously you can do it with anything you want, although not double pointed, because then all your stitches will be falling off the other end. So, but if you're doing this with straights, it's of course perfectly fine. Now, when you're making a purl stitch, your yarn, if you were knitting, we would be simply inserting our needle here, and our yarn is behind this needle. When you're going to purl, it's the opposite. You have the yarn in front of the left needle, and you're inserting your needle towards the front, not towards the back, but towards the front. Other than that, it's the same. You're wrapping the yarn around, you're switching needles and pulling it off. All right, so now you can see that your yarn is already in the front. So slide it towards the front, wrap it around, switch needles and slide off. Now the trick here is again to hold everything in place. Wrap it around. See how my yarn is not too tight? But now I give it a little tug. It's very helpful when you're purling to keep the yarn down, so you give yourself a little more room to do that little movement. In through the front, wrap around, switch needles and off. In through the front, wrap, switch, and slide off. And always your index fingers are holding everything in place so it's not sliding off. And if it does come off the needle, you may be able to just pick it up or just let it go. Keep knitting, just keep practicing. This is just a sample, as I said, and this is the reason why it's better not to set your heart on a finished project, because you do need to practice before you get there. Wrap it around, switch needles, slide off, in through the front, wrap it around, switch needles, and slide. In through the front, wrap it around, switch needles, slide off, and your last stitch, wrap, make sure it's in place. You can even help yourself a little bit with your thumb so nothing slides off, and slide your needle, and now turn around. And you can see how your fabric is already changing. So again, wrap the yarn around your pinky, hold it, index underneath, right needle behind the yarn, slide your needle into the stitch towards the front, wrap it around, switch needles, in through the front, wrap, switch, slide off, in through the front, wrap, slide, in through the front, wrap, switch needles, off. Okay. All right, so purl a few more rows and then we'll talk about the fabrics that you can create. All right, so if you've purled a few more rows, you probably have something that looks like this. This is where you were just knitting. This is the row where you switched, and this is the row where you were just, the part where you just purled. So whether you only knit or only purl, you're going to get what we call garter stitch. If you start alternating one row of purls and one row of knits, you're going to get what we call stockinette stitch, which I'm sure you recognize as the most common knitted stitch. And the stockinette has a reverse side that looks a lot like garter stitch, but not quite. If you notice here, there are big deep breaches in the garter stitch and not in the stockinette. Okay. Well, I hope that wasn't so hard. And now that you have mastered the knit and purl stitches, practice them a little bit. And I will see you in lesson 5 where you will learn to combine them in fabrics that are a little more exciting than just stockinette and garter stitch. I will see you there.